Skeletons riding bicycles, skeletons wearing fancy hats, skeletons dancing and strumming on guitars. We call these festive bony figures calaveras. In Spanish, the word calavera means skull. A lot of things that are associated with skulls and with El Dia de Muertos, the Day of the Dead, are called calaveras. For example, there are calavera drawings, candy calaveras, calavera poems, and calavera toys. The skeleton figures are not scary. In fact, they look as if they're having fun. They are the creation of Jose Guadalupe Posada, and this is his story. In 1852, in a small house in the Mexican city of Aguascalientes, Jose Guadalupe Posada was born. Lupe, as everyone called him, was the son of a baker and the sixth of 8 children. Lupe's older brother, Cirillo, became a teacher. He taught Lupe how to read and write. Lupe loved to copy the drawings he saw in the prints and in books at the school. Cirillo noted how well Lupe drew and helped him enroll in a local art academy. When Lupe was 18 years old, he began to work at Don Trinidad Pedrosa's print shop. There he discovered his lifelong passion for printing. He learned lithography. Here's how you do lithography. First, you use a grease pencil and you draw on a special flat limestone. And second, you apply chemicals and moisten the stone with water. And then third, you cover the limestone with an oil-based ink. The ink will adhere only to the drawing because the water and oil don't mix. And then you use a printing press to print the image on a piece of paper, and you can repeat as many times as you wish. Lupe also learned engraving. He helped Don Trinidad print documents, diplomas, flyers, labels for matchbooks, recipes, receipts, invitations for weddings and birthdays. To do an engraving, first you draw on a piece of wood or a metal plate, and then you use a cutting tool called a burn to carve around the drawing. This will cause the drawing to be raised above the rest of the plate. Then you cover the drawing with ink, and the ink will adhere only to the parts that are in relief, that is, the parts that are raised. And then you will use a press to print the image on a piece of paper, and you can repeat as many times as you wish. After work, Lupe, Don Trinidad, and other artisans would gather at the shop. They were unhappy with the job that people in the government were doing. Don Trinidad invited Lupe to make some drawings for a small newspaper he was involved with. It was called El Jicote, the bumblebee. Lupe drew cartoons for the paper. This was long before he drew calaveras. In one of his drawings, Lupe drew some local politicians climbing a pole and stepping over one another. By making the men look silly, he showed their greed and their other bad traits. The readers of El Jicote agreed with Lupe's point of view and laughed when they saw his cartoons. That year, some of the politicians Lupe and Don Trinidad were against lost the elections, but some remained in power and were angry at them. To avoid trouble, Lupe and Don Trinidad decided to move to the nearby city of León. Lupe lived in León for many years. He opened his own print shop, and everyone began to call him Don Lupe as a sign of respect. He married Maria de Jesus Vela, and eventually they had a son. They named him Juan Sabino. In addition to his printing work, Don Lupe began to create illustrations for books and pamphlets. He also taught lithography at a local school. He became successful and well known in the region. But in 1888, a terrible flood destroyed a large part of the city, including Don Lupe's shop. Don Lupe, his wife and their son moved to Mexico City, the capital of the country. Don Lupe worked as an illustrator and a designer in several print shops. Eventually, he was able to open his own shop near the Zocalo, the city's main square. One of the men Don Lupe worked for was Antonio Venegas. He published intriguing stories on large sheets of bright paper called broadsides. The tales were about a wide range of topics, including scary creatures, fires, miracles, violent crimes, heroes, bandits, cockfights, and bullfights. Don Lupe illustrated many of these tales. Paperboys sold the inexpensive broadsides on the streets for a few cents, and people, even people who couldn't read, bought them. They were fascinated with Don Lupe's drawings. Don Lupe and Don Antonio worked together for more than 20 years. They were always busy, especially every November 1st and 2nd during Dia de Muertos celebrations. On those days, the city was full of vendors who sold pan de muerto, the bread, and campansushil, the marigold flowers, the alfeniques, the sugar skulls, and papel picado, the paper cutouts. People bought these and other items to decorate the ofrendas, offerings they made for their loved ones who had died. For the holiday, Don Antonio and other editors published literary calaveras. They were short rhyming poems that featured a skeleton and made jokes about him or her. People found the poems very funny and bought them on the street from paperboys. A man named Manuel Mania illustrated many of these poems for Don Antonio. Don Lupe also began to illustrate them, and soon he became a master at it. Here's one of the ones he did with a little poem about love. It was a warm afternoon in the middle of May. Mr. Bones grabbed his hat and went walking that day. When he noticed a beauty on the opposite street, he ran towards her and kneeled at her feet. "You are the prettiest girl I've seen in my life. Please marry me. Please be my wife." "I am sorry, senor, but that cannot be. You're handsome and all, but too skinny for me." Don Lupe had a lot of work. He was busy all the time. He began using a printing technique that was quicker than lithography or engraving. It was called etching. To etch, first you need a pen and some acid-resistant ink, and then you draw it on a metal plate. Then you dip the plate in acid, and the acid will make the top layer disintegrate, leaving just the drawing. Then you cover the plate with ink, and the ink will adhere only to the parts that are in relief, that are raised up. And then you press the print to an image on a piece of paper. Don Lupe made thousands of drawings over the years. Only 100 or so are calaveras, but they are now his most famous images. Whether he made an etching or a lithograph or an engraving, he had to draw the image in reverse, the opposite of the way he wanted the finished work to appear. Otherwise, when the image was transferred to ink and paper, it would be backwards. See, they're opposite. This is the etching and this is the print. The inspiration behind some of Don Lupe's calaveras is clear, but for others it's not. We can try to interpret some of them. Let's see. During El Dia de Muertos, Don Lupe surely watched people going to the cemetery. They weeded and repainted the gravestones of their loved ones. They brought food and told stories about them. Sometimes they hired musicians to play their loved ones' favorite songs. In this famous calaveras picture, Don Lupe drew some skeletons dancing and partying. Was he saying that maybe El Dia de Muertos is not only a celebration of death, but also a celebration of life? A day when the dead become alive? One day, Don Lupe drew a skeleton wearing a flamboyant hat, La Catrina. The drawing was printed alongside a calavera poem about the type of woman who puts on makeup and fancy clothes and acts as if she's better than everyone else. Can you imagine the woman who inspired that drawing? Perhaps she wore a pretentious outfit and strolled through the park on a Sunday afternoon. She thought highly of herself, but acted mean and ignored others that needed help. This is the famous La Catrina. It's one of his most famous calaveras. Was Don Lupe saying that no matter how fancy your clothes are on the outside, on the inside, we are all the same, that we are all calaveras? Don Lupe saw his country, and especially Mexico City, change dramatically during his lifetime. When he was a boy, people walked or rode on horses or carriages. Now he saw people riding on bicycles. He saw streetcars traveling on tracks through the city. Everyone seemed to be going faster and faster. In this calaveras drawing, Don Lupe drew some wild skeletons racing and trampling one another. Was he saying that we can try to go faster, but one day we will all reach the same finish line and become calaveras? In 1910, when Don Lupe was 58 years old, a terrible conflict began. Today it is referred to as the Mexican Revolution. Thousands of farmers and workers throughout Mexico City were angry because they worked very hard but could barely earn enough money for their families to live on. The laborers grabbed rifles, machetes, sticks, and any weapon they could find to fight the government and the wealthy landlords it protected. But the rebellious groups that formed in different parts of the country did not work together. They began to fight not only the government but one another as well. And things spun out of control. Thousands of people lost their lives. As we've seen, most of Don Lupe's calaveras are festive and fun, but the ones he drew about La Revolucion are aggressive and frightening. Was Don Lupe saying that sometimes calaveras are not a laughing matter? Don Lupe drew some of the leaders who were involved in La Revolucion, like Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Madero. His calaveras were a way to criticize those men and express his own views. This is Emiliano Zapata, and this is Francisco Madero. He would praise them if they agreed with their decisions and actions, but he would ridicule them if he disagreed with them, just as he had poked fun at the politicians in Aguascalientes when he was a young man. In this Calaveras drawing, was Don Lupe saying that even powerful leaders one day became calaveras? Don Lupe drew calaveras of famous men, but he also drew calaveras of the people around him, like the men who swept the streets and the people who worked at the print shops. He even drew a calavera of his friend Don Antonio. There's Don Antonio. Was Don Lupe saying that calaveras are all around us? That we are all calaveras, whether we are rich or poor or famous or not? Don Lupe died on January 20th, 1913. Many people were familiar with his drawings and his calaveras, but very few people knew the artist who was behind them. It was years after his death that historians and artists such as Jean Charlot and Diego Rivera began to wonder who had drawn such wonderful images. Today, José Guadalupe Posada is not called Don Lupe anymore. He is simply called Posada, which is the way he signed his work. His art is celebrated in Mexico, in the United States, and around the world. Some people even dress like Catrinas and parade on the streets during Dia de Muertos. And on that special day, there is always somewhere an altar with an ofrenda to remember the great Don Lupe Posada. What would Posada's calaveras look like nowadays? The